Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors, so we would ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor. You can go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page there. You could sign up to our Patreon, which you can also find a link to there, but it's patreon.com/JustinCenter. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts that you do give us are tax deductible. So I would encourage you to help support us if you have enjoyed and appreciated the things that we do here. We do need your help, especially as we are looking into bringing an editor on board as well on staff here to help with the many book projects we have coming up, and there are many of them coming up. We've got a lot of really exciting stuff in the works, things that I've written, things that I've edited, but things that other people have written as well, some really wonderful stuff. So we're going to be expanding the publishing quite a bit starting this summer into the fall. There's a lot of good, great stuff coming up. And one of the things that I have been working on, as I've mentioned on previous podcasts, is a book on the subject of truth, goodness, and beauty. And so I'm going to talk about the third of those, what we call the transcendentals on the program today, and that is the question of beauty. So this book seems like maybe to some that it's a little bit different than some of the other things that I've written because it's not as directly theological, I guess, more specifically philosophical in many ways. But it really does stem from my theological convictions, and I think that these ideas are very much related. So what I want to do today is focus some on specifically the topic of beauty and talk about why that matters. And I'm not going to give away the whole book here, the contents of the entire book, but maybe it will entice you to buy it once it comes out. I have a volume on Union with Christ that's coming out first, and then we have our first Widener Institute Essays volume on Justification also coming out soon. So both of those will be out by the end of the summer. So I'm expecting that this will be out in the fall. I don't have a release date yet. It's gone through. I've completed my first draft of this book. Then I've gone through, just about done with a second overview of the book and doing some little edits. After that, I'll send it to some others to get some advice and feedback, send it to an editor and all of that stuff. So that's where we are in the process right now of this particular book. But I want to address the question of beauty today, as I've said, and ask the question, what does beauty have to do with theology? What does beauty have to do with God? Why is it that this is a topic that I'm talking about at all? Is it a topic that should matter to us? Now, as we think back at what we call the three transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty, it's sometimes given in a different order, goodness, truth, beauty. But those three things are often spoken of together as the three elements of what is like a classical culture. Right? A classical culture is a culture that values the truth, that values what is good, and values what is beautiful. So this is something that shows up, for example, in a lot of classical education resources that you'll see truth, goodness, and beauty named in all sorts of things, and you'll see it as a subtitle for all sorts of things as well. And from a Christian perspective, it's understood that the true, the good, and the beautiful are all synonymous because all of those things are to be identified with God. God is the truth, God is the good, and God also is the beautiful. But even in the pre-Christian traditions of the West, thinking about the Greek philosophers in particular, as we think about Plato and we think about Aristotle, even actually going back a bit before that, I think we can see a lot of the roots of this in Pythagoras, and in many ways you could say the roots of this are even there in Homer and the old Homeric tradition. So, but as you go back to those figures, they also put a high focus and emphasis on these questions of truth, goodness, and beauty. And so those are three kind of cornerstones of what becomes the Western tradition from the Greek era into the Roman, especially in the Christian era in the West. And what we see at the time of the Enlightenment is a subjectivizing, right? We have a subjectivizing of these things. So your truth, goodness, and beauty as the transcendentals in classical thought were not about subjective feeling. None of them were about subjective feeling. Truth was not about my truth versus your truth. There goes the truth. Of course, you had skeptics in the ancient world too. You had a whole group called the skeptics, and you had the sophists that, Plato, Socrates battles against largely, but also, Plato does, using the character of Socrates as the sophists are these people who don't really care about truth. They just care about winning an argument. But if there is any kind of chief value for, we would say, Plato, it's truth, right? So truth is not this just subjective thing. There is that which is true, and there is that which is not true. It is, our goal, or should be our goal, in our intellectual lives, to align our minds with that which is actually true. Not to just decide what is true based on our whims or based on our personal experience, but actually align ourselves with the true. And the same thing is the case with goodness. Now, when speaking of goodness or the ethical life, what Plato and Aristotle as well, but there's some differences between them. What they would see as the moral life is the life of what they call the life of happiness. But when they're speaking about happiness, eudaimonism is the technical term for this. But when we think about happiness, they're not really talking about happiness in terms of this kind of instantaneous pleasure. Right, that's how we tend to think about happiness in our culture today. We think of feeding the passions. Our desires are met, our instant desires. We are gratified in the moment. We think of that as happiness. They're not talking about happiness in that sense. They're talking about happiness in the long run. What does it mean to live a fulfilled life, a fulfilling life? What does it mean to live a life that is lived toward the good? What does it mean to be part of a society? And that society ideally should be working toward the good, and we are parts of that society. So both as individuals and collective as cultures, we are to work toward what is the good. Okay, so that means that the moral life is not arbitrary or subjective. Right? The moral life is not based upon my whims or personal feelings. It is based upon what is ultimately good. And Plato most often speaks about good as the good, right? The source of goodness. So if there's any conception of God in Plato, it is this idea of the good, which he's often been identified as God, the good, whatever that may be. And that becomes a little more clear when you get into later forms of Platonism, like Middle and Neoplatonism. So you understand here that we're saying that truth is that which is objective, right? It's that which is objectively real outside of myself, and I can actually know what is true in the classical tradition. The good is actually something that I align myself with that is real, God being the good, and I align myself with the good as I live a happy life, meaning a virtuous life, for example. And this is early Christian language as well. So read, for example, St. Ambrose of Milan. He's got a treatise called "And Jacobin, the Happy Life." And you say the happy life, that's kind of a weird title. But what he means is the virtuous life, because they're grabbing onto what is this classical language that forms how the Christian tradition then later speaks about virtue and what it means to live a life of virtue in this world. Of course, there being very much differences between how a Christian approach would look at these things and how a Greek approach would. Primarily because you have like the whole doctrine of regeneration, or the new heart that is given in Christianity, which is not there in the Greek tradition, where her virtue is habituated, but there's no idea of a new affections or a new heart that is given by God. So there's going to be certainly some differences there. Now, if you're thinking about Christians today, right, or people just in the world who believe that there is objectivity somewhere in the world, if those people still exist, and they do to some degree at least. But if you look at those individuals, they're going to fight very, very hard over these two ideas, right, of truth and goodness. So they're going to fight very hard to say, no, truth is not subjective. No, there is not your truth and my truth. There is the truth. And they're also going to fight very strongly for moral values, to say that no, there are some things that are just morally impermissible. They are morally wrong. They're morally wrong not just in some circumstances, but they are morally wrong in all circumstances, and they're not just morally wrong because it happens to bring pain to one person or another, but they're morally wrong because these things are morally wrong. Okay, so a moral objectivity. And people will fight for that as much as culture itself is moving away from any objectivity in truth or morality. Though in many ways, I think that the farther a lot of the far left progressive ideologies tend to grow today, they're really moving toward a really strong moral absolutism. I mean, it's already there. It is a very strong moral absolutism of a different form. And they won't see it in that way. But if you listen to the way that things are discussed, that certainly is underlying what they're saying. They really believe that there is a moral absolute and that moral absolute can be broken. Though it's in a particular progressive narrative that they see that, rather than an objective set of commands given by God or something. So the third of these, though, right? So truth and goodness, like the church recognizes these things as important, and we recognize that a pure subjectivity in those areas is bad, and there's at least some fighting against it. But when it comes to the third of these transcendentals, beauty, we tend not to do anything with it. Right? We tend to say that, well, beauty is just nothing more than pure subjective taste. Beauty is just whatever you happen to enjoy. So beauty becomes just personal aesthetic enjoyment. So whatever may bring delight to my senses and my eyes as I see something, and it sounds pleasant, it looks pleasant to me, and as I visualizing, say, a beautiful sunset, it is beautiful, but when I'm saying it's beautiful, all that I mean is that I am in some way getting some kind of pleasure out of something visual. Or maybe we think of beautiful music, and if we're thinking about beautiful music, what brings delight from beautiful music is just what I hear that happens to bring me pleasure, because perhaps I hear a song that I listen to at a nice time in my life, and it brings me back to that time. So I have this subjective, pleasurable experience that is brought about by the music, and so the beauty is in that internalized experience, and that's all that beauty is. And we know the famous saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There's actually, when I've looked into that saying, there's actually a bit of debate as to exactly where that comes from. There's at least a form of it that is very ancient. So it's not like this idea is totally new. It's always been there, in that there have always been relativists. Like in the ancient world, there were relativists too. It's not, when I say classical tradition, I'm not saying that there were no relativists or no skeptics. There were, but the classical tradition that roots Western culture in people like Plato and Aristotle, they very much have this conception that beauty is something real. Like beauty is something that is beyond just what gives me personal pleasure, in the same way that happiness is beyond just my own personal pleasure. So, think about this. Because people tend to say, oh, well, how can you say that there's anything objective in beauty? Because, I find something beautiful and someone else finds something else beautiful. I mean, culture does this all the time. If you look through if you were to watch HGTV shows from 20 years ago, was HGTV on back then? I don't know. I didn't watch it. Yeah, I did. Yeah, they had like trading spaces and all that. Okay, yeah. So, right, if you're going to watch it, I'm sure it's been on for a long time. I just don't pay enough attention to know these things. But, if you watch, say, one of those shows from like the 90s and you look at the design, like you're going to look at it and say, that's really ugly. Why on earth did people think that was attractive? Why did people think that, MC Hammer pants were cool? And all you youngins listening don't know what I'm talking about probably, but... I mean, it's the fact is, when I see trends of, Zoomers, as a millennial, I often think that, wow, like those are the ugly clothes that my mom wore in the 90s. Like it doesn't look attractive to me. And some of you may look at, people in my generation and say that what we wear is ugly because our pants are too tight. I know that's like a thing on TikTok or whatever you kids are using these days. But so what do we do with that? Like, we all do have subjective opinions, and our own opinions seem to change, because you may have thought something was attractive in the 90s, and by 2021, like, you don't think it's attractive either, because culture has changed. The standards of what we see as aesthetically pleasing have now changed. So like, what do we do with all that? Does that mean that there is nothing left besides this kind of pure subjectivity and, that's it? Well, yep, that's it. It's all subjectivity. No, but what we do with that is we say, well, think about this. Like, if you ask people opinions about what, or if you're not posing it as an opinion, right? If you pose a question about, I don't know, a controversial issue today, ask about the effectiveness of COVID vaccines and their side effects or whatever, and people will blow up about this, and they'll say, no, this is right because of this and this thing that I read, and other people say this is true because of this thing I read. The point is, people will have different claims to what is true, and just because people have different subjective claims and different beliefs about what is true does not mean that truth is relative. Like, there is actual truth to this. So there's no reason why we can't say the same thing about beauty. It's true that there are differences in subjective taste, but differences in taste do not equate to beauty itself. Okay, so you can have a different taste than somebody else, but that doesn't mean, first of all, that your taste is as good as their taste or their taste is as good as your taste. But your taste is not what beauty is. Your taste is your personal perception of the objective thing and transcendent reality of beauty insofar as you are perceiving it according to your own sense experience, in your own intellectual thought life, in your own feelings, and those kinds of things. But it's not to be identified with beauty itself. So starting there, right, the primary claim that I'm making here is that beauty is something that is not subjective. Okay, so the primary claim I'm making is beauty is something that is real and objective. That just as truth is real, just as moral value and moral goodness is real, so is beauty something that is objectively real. It is something that transcends the self and even transcends the created world, the material world. It's something that is actually real. And when we have an experience of something that is beautiful, we are actually encountering something that is objective and real. We are encountering beauty. It comes to us in our subjective experience, but it is not in itself defined by its subjectivity, right? Beauty is not defined by how I perceive aesthetic pleasure in one way or another. It may be how I sense beauty or how I encounter beauty in a particular aesthetic, one or another. But that does not account for beauty itself. It is not identical with that. Okay. So there's the starting point here. Okay, so if that's the case, if I'm making the case, beauty is something objective, it is not subjective, it is not identifiable with my own personal experience. So in my experience, I can encounter the objective thing, the transcendent reality that is beauty. What exactly is beauty? Now, if you look at someone like Plato, Plato does talk some about what is beautiful. He uses this language quite a bit. We could delve into some of the specific dialogues where he talks about some specifics here, but I'm going to kind of do instead just an overview. I can get more in depth in this if anyone cares about this topic. Who knows if anyone will watch this one, but I never know what people are going to watch and what they're not. It's not necessarily what I always enjoy talking about that people want me to talk about, but I enjoy these subjects a lot. So nonetheless, it is what it is. So Plato, as he describes beauty, if you know anything about Plato's philosophy, Plato has this idea of what he calls the forms, that there is this ideal realm, this realm of ideas, that which is an idea or immaterial, those things are more real than the material world, that the material objects of this world are a reflection of ideas. So when I see, for example, a dog in this world, that dog is real. I mean, it's a real object in front of me, but that is sharing in, that dog is participating in something that is even more real or has more being, a source of its being, which is this universal essence of dogness that every dog partakes in and does so in different ways than one another. But it's this unchanging idea of what a dog is. So that is more enduring and perfect than the individual instantiation of the dog that I am seeing in this particular instance, because that particular dog can change and die, and then another dog will be born, and they come and go, and they experience all sorts of change. But the idea itself is something that transcends the particulars of this world, because the idea of what a dog is transcends any earthly circumstance, to the point that if every dog were to die, the only thing that would be left is what? The idea of what a dog is, regardless of whether there's any particular dogs even living on this earth. So with that idea, Plato says that the most real things are not physical at all. So if that's true, then the physical world is essentially an imitation. Now, when he's thinking about questions like art, which we often associate as part of beauty in these discussions, if we're thinking about art, art for Plato then becomes kind of an imitation of an imitation. Because if you're making art who's a more realist art, okay, so if you're making art whose purpose it is to reflect the natural world, say if you're making a painting of a wealthy patron, right, and they want you to paint a portrait to hang above their mantle, and you paint it, it looks just like them. Well, they're already an imitation of something, and now you're imitating an imitation. So, what does that mean? Why are you, or if you paint, say, a vase of flowers, well, you're just painting what is a material object, which is a reflection of the idea of flower. And so now you're kind of a couple steps removed. So in light of that, we may say, well, beauty for Plato would not really fit very well into the category of kind of the visual arts. And to some extent, that's true. Like, to some extent, to say that about Plato is probably true. Plato does recognize that there can be some good in visual arts, and he does see things like music as necessary to fulfill a kind of bodily need. We do need to please the senses. It's not bad. He says we can overindulge the senses, which is not necessarily good. So for someone like Plato, there's not going to be this strong emphasis on the visual arts, though I will say there are differences in what he says at different points in different dialogues. Okay, but when Plato's talking about beauty, he's essentially going to say that there are kind of degrees of beauty, right? There are some things that are more beautiful than others. And we may say that an art piece is less beautiful, perhaps, than the thing itself. Perhaps, if I were to get a painting of my wife, the painting may be beautiful, but it's not as beautiful as my wife, right? So it's imitative. And so it doesn't share in beauty in the same way. And so there's a kind of scale of beauty. So some things partake of beauty more than other things. So some things are actually more beautiful than others. And some things are closer to that ideal of what beauty is, right? The ideal form of beauty means the essence of beauty, the idea of beauty. And some things partake of that more than others. So the visual arts may do this for Plato to some extent, but that's not really where he's going to focus. So Plato instead is going to say that the way that we see a truer beauty is not just in external things at all, not just in aesthetics, but real true beauty is seen in a life of virtue. So if there is a virtuous life that is lived, that is habituated in an individual, then there is an internal beauty that is more important than an external beauty. It doesn't mean the external beauty doesn't exist or it's not real, but there's a more important thing, which is that internal beauty of one's character. And this is something that we still see today, right? We talk about this. We talk about the inner beauty versus the outer beauty. I've watched this show about like guys in Texas doing these beard contests, and they talked about their outer beards and their inner beards. Like, you have a beautiful inner beard if you have a good character and heart. So like we still have this internal, external kind of thing. We recognize, right, that you could be physically attractive but a terrible human being, and so your physical attractiveness doesn't matter. That's what Plato is getting at here, that there is something that is inherently more beautiful, or partakes of beauty in a greater way that is internal rather than purely external. Again, it doesn't mean that the external things don't matter at all or are not beautiful, but there's something that is more important. So there's kind of a hierarchy here, again, of beauty. Ultimately, though, beauty is for Plato identified not exactly with the good, but we kind of ascend to higher and higher beauties as we look at the physical things of this world. Maybe you see paintings, and then you look at the real thing, and then you look at the idea, and the idea of the thing is even more beautiful, and you kind of ascend through beauty, he would say. It's that which you ascend through to connect with the good, who would be God. It is basically Plato's conception of God. So beauty leads us to God. Beauty leads us to the one who is eternal. And in saying all of this, Plato is getting at the idea, again, that beauty is something that is truly objective. If it is something that is an ideal form, some things partake of, others don't partake of, some partake of more than others. And so that basic conception stands behind the entirety of really the Western tradition that's building upon Plato, coming from that tradition, that there is this idea of something that is real and objective, that something is sharing and when it is beautiful, and that there is a kind of transcendental experience in some ways. And I know that term probably sounds very mystical, but what I mean is that when we encounter beauty, something beautiful in this world, we are encountering something that is really of another world, that is reflected in this world, right? When you encounter something, if you encounter a beautiful sunset, if you go see other, natural beauties or artistic beauties, if you go hear a wonderful symphony, you are kind of taken away from where you currently are. You kind of get wrapped up in that experience, right? And as you're wrapped up in that experience of beauty, you are transcending this earthly reality in some way. You're seeing a reflection of God himself as he's reflecting himself in this created world. That's what Plato is really getting at here. But it's not just Plato that speaks in this way. You even find this as you go back farther. It's not like Plato's the first one to say this. No, I know a lot of times people, when they deal with Western thought, Western philosophy, you can check out my History of Western thought series where I go through the major figures of Western thought. When I did that, I started not with Plato, but I started with Thales. And the reason for that is that Plato really is entering into a conversation that's already happening. And a lot of times people start with Plato, and I understand why they start with Plato, because he's the most significant early figure, and in many ways, he's the first guy who's got a lot of writings and who's got a lot of ideas that you can really kind of sink your teeth into. But he is jumping into the middle of a conversation that's already been happening for quite a long time. So some of the background does help. Plato's not coming from nowhere, right, when he says these things. So a figure that I find really interesting and kind of bizarre is the figure Pythagoras. He's known mostly for the Pythagorean theorem. That's how we know his name. But the Pythagoreans were a philosophical group, but kind of a religious sect in some ways as well. And they were really obsessed with numbers. And the Pythagoreans believed that numbers were at the root of all things. And this is part of what a lot of the early Greek philosophers tried to do, was tried to find what is the underlying kind of connective thing that unites all reality together. What's the thing that brings everything together? And so they say things like a fire or water. Everything is made of fire. Everything is made of water. They try to come up with some like kind of material, physical element that unites all things, that explains the kind of coherence of this world, right? That this world even makes any sense. So the Pythagoreans do the same thing, but instead of grabbing onto a physical object, they say, well, numbers. And they make a lot of interesting points. Some of it's very much valid. They emphasize mathematics, which of course we know that mathematics is extremely important discipline. We know that math stands behind a lot of the created world in ways that they wouldn't have even understood at that time. And that becomes far more apparent. We know the importance of information, as we know things about things like DNA that they obviously had no concept of at the time. But in many ways, they really are grabbing onto something that is real. There is this information that stands behind things, and that information is, for them, numbers. But what's so interesting about this is they're seeing that there is numeric consistency in terms of measuring things in the natural world. But they also note that if you're thinking about measurement, say, they point out that, well, you can take a string on an instrument, what we would now have as like a guitar, something like that. If you take a string on an instrument and measure it by different numbers, so if it's a different length, it plays a different sound when you pluck it. So they made the argument that which is beautiful, even like beautiful music, is in some way connected to what is that underlying reality of all things. And for them, that was numbers. And why this is so significant is to say that they believed that moral values were connected to numbers, and truth was inherently numeric, and that beauty was in fact numeric. So the idea is that there is one coherent reality that all of our discussion of what is good and what is true and what is beautiful are all pointing to. For them, it was numbers. But they're seeing that there's some reality that we're tapping into when we see any of these three things, whether it's truth, goodness, or beauty. So they're all very much connected. And this is what we're missing today, is that we've taken that last one and kind of chopped it off from the others. In many ways, we've chopped all three off from each other. So there are many things that happen historically that cause that to happen. But for the Greeks, for the classic tradition, they're seeing these as a very much a unified whole. So that happens in Plato, and then Aristotle also discusses some ideas about beauty as well. Aristotle will, and these go prior to Aristotle largely. He's repeating a lot of things that were in the Pythagoreans and others as well. He says things like, well, he asks like, what is it that makes like a physical object beautiful, right? So he asks like, Plato doesn't really talk about this so much. He talks about kind of what beauty is and its transcendence and those kind of things. But Aristotle gets to the kind of more obvious question of like, okay, so what is it that makes an object beautiful? Like when I see one thing, I see it as beautiful, and another I could say that's really ugly. And we all do this. Like everyone does this. Why is it that we all have opinions about movies we like and don't like? Why is it that we can stand next to somebody and have a heated debate for many hours? Like, why is it that you can create a YouTube video essay that's 3 hours long on The Last Jedi and talk about why it's terrible? Like, why is it that you can pick apart the movie and objectively say it's a bad movie and make arguments? Because you're functioning as if there is such a thing as a good and bad movie. If there's no such thing as any aesthetic standard or any standard of what is good art or any standard of what is beautiful, then you can't do that. You're just, I say it's good, he says it's not good. It brings me feelings of pleasure. It doesn't bring me feelings of pleasure. There you go. End of conversation. That's it. Makes for a very boring life. Boring discussions about movies, right? Or music or anything else. No, but like we all act as if there is something that really makes some things better than others. Like we're not going to go watch Tommy Wiseau's The Room and say, wow, that was like a really good movie. Or Birdemic or Troll 2 or one of these, or I guess Sharknado, but like, when you're making a movie that's like supposed to be bad on purpose, it's kind of stupid. It ruins the whole point. But people watch bad movies and unite over bad movies because they know they're bad, because everyone's agreed that they're bad. Like, even if you don't agree with somebody about what movies are good, you may have debate with somebody about what's good. You can both agree oftentimes of like what's not good. Like, that is a bad movie when you watch The Room. Nobody thinks, maybe some, Tommy Wiseau seems to think it's a good movie, but, and then he says it's like a joke, I guess, but it clearly was not. I don't know. Anyway, like there are things that are bad. Or think about like comedy. There are jokes that are funny and there are jokes that are not funny. And there are jokes that like no one thinks are funny because they're not funny or they're offensive or like in such a way that they're like really offensive and awkward. Not just in the way that people are being overly offended by things, but like, we have standards and we know what those standards are to some extent. Even if you haven't thought through what those things are, like you can watch The Room, and even if you don't know much about movies, you can say that was really bad, right? Like that was not good. You might find it very entertaining. I was very entertained by the movie. And in fact, if beauty is just pleasure, like I have laughed pretty hard at that movie and enjoyed myself more than some movies that are well made. So if that's all beauty is, like, why not? Then I guess it brought about pleasure and there you go. So it's a good movie. Like we know that there's something going on beyond that. So Aristotle then asks, like, what are some of these things that make things beautiful? What are some of these things that we see? And when we see those things, we say that is a beautiful thing. Whereas we don't say that about other things. So Aristotle talks about some of this in his Poetics, for example, and he talks about a story. And this is one example, because this is true in many things. But if there's a good story, Aristotle makes the case that you have a bunch of little pieces, but the pieces come together to form a unified whole. Right? So something that is beautiful is something that is unified. if let's take The Last Jedi. Okay, let's take The Last Jedi, because it's a movie that is very divisive, and it's one that, I love Star Wars, so I've seen it a bunch of times, but and I have mixed feelings about the movie. I don't hate it like some people do, and I think there are some really wonderful and beautiful things about the movie too, but I'm also not a fan of the sequel trilogy as a whole. So I have mixed feelings about it. But in that movie, one of the biggest complaints, sorry if you haven't seen it, I don't know what to tell you, but if you have seen it, one of the biggest complaints about that movie is there's this whole plot going to Canto Bight, where there is, Finn and Rose go off in this kind of separate side mission, and they're sidetracked. The mission itself doesn't really go anywhere. They end up failing in the mission. And a complaint that a lot of people have is, what in the world does this side plot have to do with the rest of the movie? It seems very disjointed. The scene was too long. It seemed like a little piece that just didn't really fit the whole picture. I think there is a whole picture that's very clearly kind of going on there, though I do tend to think that the scene went on for much longer than it should have. But why is it that people look at that and make that specific criticism? Why is that bad? Because we recognize that a film or a story, it can have different pieces, and it must have different pieces. So you've got to have different scenes. You can't just have the same thing happening the entire movie. So you want things that are different. You want to have the little pieces there, but you want them to fit together in something that is a unified whole that makes sense. So all of the little pieces look like they fit into the greater whole. So when we're looking for that, which is beautiful, we're looking for some kind of wholeness, right? We're looking for pieces that fit together, that cohere with one another. Another, example of this is in something like interior design. Okay, I care a lot about interior design. I could talk way too much about interior design and architecture, and I love the arts in general, so I could talk about any of this stuff forever. Art is my big love besides theology, and I could easily have gone into that field as well. But if you're looking at, for example, what makes something good in interior design, what makes something, and there are many things, but one of the things that people will say is that it's much better to have some kind of coherent style that you're going to just be consistent with. You may have a bunch of beautiful objects, but when you put them in a room together, they don't really fit together. Something can be beautiful on its own, and something else can be beautiful on its own, but when you put them in a room together and they're two very different design styles, the colors clash, they're just placed kind of weirdly in relation to each other. It doesn't fit, because what you want is a unified style. You want themes and colors and things that just kind of go together. And if you don't see that, it can look very jarring. Even if you don't really know why it looks jarring, it looks jarring. So there has to be some kind of, coherence there, or greater unity. So for Aristotle, that's true about beauty in general and beautiful things, but it's true largely about narrative. So he's talking about something which has a beginning, middle, and an end, right? Which, of course, that's true, but Aristotle really is the first one to kind of spell out that's what's in a story. A good story is you have a coherent story. You have a beginning that sets up the protagonist, the character, that sets up the plot well. You have the middle, which is a story that expands upon that and brings out various themes. And the ending is something that is cohesive, that brings a conclusion to all of the themes that began in the beginning, were developed in the middle, and then it's all wrapped up well so that the point and overall themes of that story are understood well. So you have the parts and the whole there. But that's true, as I said, interior design. This is true of other things as well. So Aristotle also brings up, which is often discussed in these questions of beauty as well, things like proportion. Things have to be properly proportioned. There are certain proportions which our eye naturally grabs onto and thinks look better than others. This is part of what they call the golden ratio. That there is... there's some debate about where the golden ratio actually came from, as to whether it's really a Renaissance thing or if it actually goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. But it's this idea that there are kind of perfect dimensions to that which looks beautiful to the eye. whether that's the Parthenon or whether that's statuary or something else. So there are proper proportions for the human body and the human face, for example. There's kind of the rule of thirds. There are many rules of thirds, actually, in all different kinds of arts. But one of these is that you have kind of, if you're drawing a face and it's properly proportioned, if you're looking at ancient Greek statues or Roman statues or Renaissance statues, which follow a lot of the same rules, the bottom third of the face, right, has the chin and the mouth, and then the middle third has eyes and nose, and then the top third goes to the top of the head. And if those proportions get messed up, the person's face looks weird and it doesn't look natural to us. But they're going to often make the argument that this is true of different aspects of the human figure, but not just the human figure, all sorts of other things as well. And we know this when something is not proportioned right, and we notice that something is just a little off. You notice that something is just a little odd. Say you're doing a drawing of a person and you make their head a little big. Like, it will stand out to you, even if it's really minor, because the proportions are off. So something about proportion is very important in our conception of beauty. So Aristotle will grab onto that. And then another one of these rules that is still a rule in like many arts today is symmetry. And so that, this is true when you look at studies where they ask people about the attractiveness of certain individuals, and they realize that people with symmetrical faces are more attractive than non-symmetrical faces. And you can call that, bigoted or whatever, but like, it's a biological phenomena. It's just the way it is. And I'm not saying that this is somebody who's perfectly symmetrical either. Like, none of us really are. But if the face is more symmetrical, it's considered more attractive. So we like symmetry. We like things to have symmetry and balance and to fit together on both sides in the right way. And a place that you can see a lot of this is in home design, in architecture. And once you start to learn some of the basic fundamentals of architecture, like some of the basic fundamentals of what makes a building attractive, like a home, and what makes it unattractive, once you start to learn some of those fundamentals, you start noticing when things don't fit into that, and it can start to drive you a little crazy. But if you want to learn about this, by the way, there's a blog called McMansion Hell. I would recommend that. And I love to pick on the McMansion because it's the best example of this. Because the McMansion is the modern home that is very large, and you have to have a lot of money to buy one. And by buying one, you're showing people that you can live out in a nice area in the suburbs and you can have a very big home. But your home is probably without any class or taste whatsoever, and it's probably very ugly. So if you look, for example, at a lot of the McMansion homes that I've noticed have like little triangular sections, but like tons of triangular sections. Not like a one angular triangular home that is meant to be just that shape, but like a triangle here, one here, and then maybe a square here in the back, and it all is just kind of mismatched, shoved together. Nothing is even. Nothing looks good. Like, it's not following those rules. So when you look at it, your eye doesn't know where to look. For example, like when you see homes that don't have a clear front. It's the thing that drives me crazy with homes. We don't see a clear front because your eye doesn't know where to look. And you're like, what is that? It looks weird. And you may not realize why it looks weird, but if it doesn't have a clear front, it looks weird because you need to have that kind of center to look at. Your eye is looking for that. You're searching for it. So that's just one of these areas. There's a lot I could say about home architecture and what makes things attractive and unattractive. But the point is, we do have these basic conceptions of things in the physical world that we find attractive and some that we find unattractive. So in what Aristotle's observing here, the question is that just, the product of, just the mechanisms, the blind mechanisms of evolution that we happen to enjoy things a certain way because, for whatever reason, for our survival. And I know there are all sorts of explanations, but I'm not going to get into the particulars of them. But just for the sake of our survival, we happen to learn to enjoy things with symmetry and wholeness and balance and all of this. That's all there is to it. And I'm saying there's not. I think there are significant reasons, just in terms of how we function in light of beauty that really don't fit the materialist narrative there either. But so we've got basically these two elements that we've already outlined, okay, at this point. So first we've got in Plato, in the classical tradition, we're going to say that beauty is something that transcends this world and enters into this world, so that when we encounter something beautiful, we are seeing something transcendent that is reflected there. So there's something objective and real that we're encountering when we see the beautiful. In Aristotle, we see there are certain visual things, and it's not just visual either. We can talk about harmony with music. There's a reason why when you hear a bad singer, like you kind of do that, like you cringe. You're like, you feel uneasy. It doesn't sound good. It's not pleasant. It's not beautiful, right? So we talk about harmony with music, but there are certain things then that we recognize as beautiful and others that aren't. So a home that is, say, symmetrical and it's a unified whole, the pieces all fit together, it's well taken care of, doesn't have to be giant, but we could recognize that that is a beautiful home. We could see another home that perhaps provides shelter, perhaps provides more shelter because it's bigger and fits more things in it, but it's really ugly. It's not matched at all. The windows are totally different. The windows are like all uneven in random places on the house. You have like bumps and different shapes in all different places, and it doesn't look good. We could say that first house shares in beauty in a way that the second doesn't, because it brings us a picture of wholeness that we don't have in the second. And the reason that we look at wholeness then, or unity, is because this is a reflection of God and God's ordering of this world. This all makes perfect sense as you look at just the creation account of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, but Genesis 1 largely. As you look at God's creative work in creation and compare the Old Testament Genesis narrative to some of the other ancient Near Eastern texts, when you look at the Enuma Elish or various other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, generally the not just generally but like universally, this is like the ancient Near Eastern myths have a creation story that is built from chaos. So everything starts with chaos. It starts with, there's a war between the gods. The Tiamat is chopped in half. This goddess Tiamat is chopped in half, and half of is then formed into the sky, and half is formed into the land. But the point is, the creation itself, the order of the world, is a mixture of some kind of coherence, but also of chaos. And these two things are paralleled with one another. So things aren't very good as they are created. They're created out of strife, out of war, out of fighting. Now, the fact is, there is chaos in the world, and there is order and unity in the world. This much is obvious. Like, duh. Look around you. This is clear. There's order and chaos. What's different, though, about the Christian narrative and the way that the Christian narrative frames this is, in the Old Testament Jewish narrative as well. But in the Old Testament narrative, it doesn't come out of just chaos, but we see that God is a God who is at rest. He is at peace. God makes commands, and the earth is created. The heavens are created. The earth is created. The sea is created. The land is created. We see that it's structured. It's set up in this 7-day cycle. And then we have, at the end, a day of rest. Like, God does the work. He puts things together exactly where he wants to be, and then he has a day of rest. There's no chaos in the picture at all. Now, chaos comes into the picture. Like, there is that chaos that comes later where you have Adam and Eve and sin that enters into the world. Even beyond that, you also have the sin of the serpent already being there. So there's clearly something already going on. Even though Eden itself is this perfect place, you still got the devil there. But the point is that the chaos is not inherent in creation itself, and it does not originate in the act of creation as creation. So God is one who is orderly. God creates things purposefully and in an orderly fashion. And everything has its very particular realm and place. So we have everything being perfectly organized. So that, it's not like there's a god of the sea and a god of the sky and they're all doing all sorts of different things against each other. No, you have this one unified artist, okay, this one unified creator who's put all the pieces together. They are not disparate. They are not against each other. And a lot of ancient myths, you have, fire versus water kind of stuff, which, makes sense when you look at the elements and how they behave with one another. But no, you have a unified artist. He takes all of the pieces, puts them in their proper place, and makes this bigger unified whole. So you see that there's an order in creation. If you look at the days, they're not just totally random, but they're purposeful. So you have within the narrative of the creation week, you have the first 3 days where you have these various realms that God first makes. You have the sky, you have the water and the air, and then you have the land. And then on the days that parallel those, days 4, 5, and 6, you have God creating that which goes into those realms that he's created. So you have then on the 4th day, the sun and the moon, which are supposed to be the lights that govern the heavens, right? So you have the place that is the heavens, and then you have the things that fill the heavens. So that's all put together, exactly where it's supposed to go. Then you have the water, and you have the fish that are created in parallel. They're made for that particular space. Then you have the birds. They're made for that particular space, which is the air. You have the land. The animals are made for that space. And then man and woman are created as kind of the crowning achievement of that creation to rule over it as God's representatives on this earth. So as you see all of those pieces being put together, it's very clear that there is this coherence and beauty and symmetry and all of the things that we're talking about that Aristotle recognized as beautiful in the story of creation itself. So this means that when we look at things like why is it that balance and symmetry and all of these kinds of things, why is it that those are the things that humans naturally grab onto as beautiful? We would say because that is the product of an orderly God who actually made things with a certain order and for certain purposes. So when you recognize that when a person creates something that is beautiful, say a beautiful piece of music or a beautiful home or a painting or whatever it might be, what you are recognizing is that person is mirroring that which is true about God. And that's even true when somebody's decorating their home. Like when you put up things on your walls in a certain place so that they kind of fit together well, like you are being like God in that. You are demonstrating the orderliness of his creation, and you are putting things in a certain order on purpose because we were made to be like him. And we just like Adam was made in the garden to tend the garden, take care of it, to be Lord over the garden, serving under God, but also being king over that garden in some ways, and that sanctuary. It is a kind of early temple sanctuary. It's a place where God is present. You also see imagery of these beautiful rivers and greenery, things that we would associate with beautiful scenery. So we have this beauty there that Adam is to tend. It's like there's a little piece of that as each of us has our own little sanctuary. If you have a home, this home that I'm in now is the first time my wife and I have actually owned a home. We've been in parsonages before, and it's a blessing to actually own a home. But there was something different about buying it ourselves, because when we bought it ourselves, it just feels like this is our place. Like we can really do with it what we want. And you kind of settle into this mode of like tending it, right? It's this inclination we have from Adam that is kind of in our genes. It's in our DNA, right? We have this desire to make our place our own and to decorate it and to design it and do what we want with it. We are being like Adam, and in that way we are being like God. God who created the heavens and the earth as his sanctuary, and then Adam was placed in this special sanctuary in the Garden of Eden to tend to that, and we do something similar in our homes and in the places that we are. This is why we delight in things that we think are beautiful, even if we might disagree about what is beautiful. I may think something is very tacky that is in your home, but you may love it and find it beautiful. But what we're doing is we're connecting to the same point, right? We're connecting to something, a reality that is deep within us. Whether we totally agree on what's beautiful or not, we're grabbing onto that same inherent inclination that we have to create and to make that which is orderly and beautiful. And, as you think about just the broader kind of narrative of the Old Testament and where you see that beautiful things tend to show up, right? Things that you would consider to be beautiful or that people in general would consider to be beautiful. It is that which is connected to the presence of God. There is a clear connection between God and beauty. We can look at specific psalms that make that connection very obvious, but we can also see that just in the nature of worship and what worship is. So that's, where do we see artistry? We see it in the temple. We see the carving of the cherubim, which says that in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place, we have this image that was made by human artisans. Like, even though there are actual cherubim with God in the throne room, you can have just actual cherubim there. God said, no, I want the artisans to make the cherubim. And they make the cherubim so that the beauty of the art enters into the presence of God. And all of the furniture of the temple, the lampstands, everything else, which are not just in the temple, but also first in the tabernacle, then in the temple. But all of that is beautiful, and it's all put together with purpose and meaning, and God wants people to be part of that, that the beauty they create is reflective of Him, and that's why He is present in these beautiful places. And so we have that with the priesthood, right? The Old Testament priesthood, there are very specific robes they are supposed to wear. There is this imagery of beauty that is to be mirrored there. And Old Testament worship is absolutely worship of a beautiful God, and it is beautiful worship. So, I know I'm kind of running out of time here, and there's so much more I want to talk about. Let me know if you want me to. I could talk about this forever, but I don't know if this is even interesting to anyone, so we'll see what you all think. Please do let me know in the comments below if you're interested in this topic. There's a lot I could say. But one thing I do want to say, though, is, and I know that I've gotten this comment before, especially when I talk about my clothing, because I like to wear classic menswear, and people bring things up like, well, doesn't the New Testament, like, doesn't Peter say that whole thing about how women aren't supposed to, like, show off their beauty in, like, jewelry and makeup and all of that stuff, but in a godly character? Yes, Scripture does say that. So what does that mean? Does that mean you're supposed to, like, be ugly? Does that mean that external beauty doesn't count? No. What Peter is saying is exactly what the Platonists would have understood as well, and Aristotelians would have understood, especially when you get to the Neoplatonists like Plotinus, he makes this even more clear. But what they would have understood as well is that the internal character is more beautiful than just what is external appearance. It's, if you wear, like, expensive, nice-looking clothes and you're a horrible human in terms of your character, like, that doesn't matter. The important thing is the internal character. But it doesn't mean that the externals don't matter at all. Okay, it doesn't mean that the externals are irrelevant or have no purpose or function at all. Because to say that is to say that God didn't know what He was doing when He told the people of Israel to do and make beautiful things. Like, He commanded beauty too. And God is also very adamant through the prophets about the evils of hypocrisy, when they just perform the rituals and do all the stuff, but their heart is not repentant. So the internal character has to be transformed. And that is key, and that is most important. But it doesn't mean that the beauty is not important. Because as we reflect beauty in this world, we can reflect that which is true about God. And here's the thing. All of that shifts depending on character too. Because if you are of a character that, say you just really love money, and you love wealth, you love status, and you buy something that's beautiful, why are you buying it? Are you buying it because you want to enjoy God and display the beauty that He's created? No. You're doing it because you want to show off that you have money, and you're like, oh, look at my Gucci shirt or whatever, which isn't beautiful anyway. But you're doing things for the purpose of self-gratification. So the outward stuff then becomes worse. But if the character is conformed to what it should be by the Spirit of God, then you can reflect beauty, but doing it in a way that actually honors God and displays His beauty, instead of doing it in a way that says, like, I'm just really into myself. And I think about this with dressing up as well, because I know, I dress up a lot, obviously, as you can tell in my videos. I don't actually, people always say that I'm like the guy who wears suits every day. I literally never wear suits, ever. I wear chinos and sports coats and blazers like every day. Not actually a suit, because technically to be a suit, it has to be the same fabric and color, matching pants and jacket. I wear chinos pretty much every day. So it's not technically a suit. But yeah, you get the point. Nonetheless, what was I getting at here? Yeah, so you could say like, oh, you could dress up because you're like, oh, I want people to think I'm cool, I guess, but people don't really think that when you dress like this. It's not like cool. But I don't know what you think. But it's not about that. Like, dressing well is about presenting yourselves to show respect for other people. Right? If I'm invited to your home and I dress well and I show up to your home dressed well, I'm making a statement to you that says I cared about coming here and I cared enough about you, and I see this as a valuable and important event, and so I put the time in to like take a shower and put my nice clothes on and put a tie on. Like it's showing respect and honor to others. You're not doing it to go over there and say I dress better than you. If you're doing that, then like stop. It's not what you're supposed to be doing. So there's a difference here in terms of why and how you're doing things. And that's really what Peter's getting at when he talks about this is, if all you're concerned about is like just looking nice on the outside, like, come on, worry about your character. That's the most important thing. Okay. So with all of that, I'm out of time here. Yeah, let me know what you thought of this. I don't know if anyone's interested in this at all, or you're like, this is really boring. Who cares? But it's a topic that I love, so for whatever that's worth. Well, thanks for watching and or listening. Make sure you do subscribe on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe on your podcast app to the audio podcast as well. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.